Hello everyone, this is Joshua Phillips for the Ohio Valley Chess Club. If you saw the first version, this is a redone version of my video on the basic rules of chess due to some errors I spotted in the first video. But let's just go right into it. So if you're watching this video to learn the rules of chess or just wanted to watch, start by saying this is the initial setup for a chessboard. It's an 8 by 8 board. Note that by tradition we label the horizontal columns with the letters A through H and the vertical columns 1 through 8, but it's a 8 by 8 board. From either player's perspective, a dark square goes in the bottom left corner and a light square goes in the bottom right corner, and it's a checkered pattern. This is the initial setup. I'll talk about the pieces as I get to them in order. First thing to say is that the next thing is chess is a turn-based game, so the players alternate turns, making one move at a time. And the objective of chess, to highlight the kings here, is to capture the enemy king. Technically, the game stops when the opponent can no longer prevent you from capturing the king on your next turn, which is what checkmate means. So that's a bit of an overview. Now I'm going to clear the board and talk about the pieces one at a time. Okay, so the board's clear. The first chess piece to discuss is the kings, which again, the objective in the game is to capture the opponent's king. Now the king's movement is that if it is your turn, and you have a king on the board, the king can move to any of the squares adjacent to it of your choice, assuming that none of your own pieces are on that square. So for instance, just to throw a piece onto the board, throw a couple pieces onto the board, this black king, if it were black's turn, could move to any of these squares, could not move to this square with the black knight because pieces cannot capture their own color, and the king could also choose to move to capture the white knight. The king's capturing is that when it moves onto a square, it captures an enemy piece if it's on that square, and captured pieces simply leave the board. So that's the king's movement, right? Any of the adjacent squares. And if the king moves into an enemy piece, it is captured, and you cannot move onto a square with one of your own pieces. And the king's start, note on the E file as the board is labeled, it's the fourth square from the right for the white pieces, and the fourth square from the left from black's perspective. Note that the kings are directly across from each other on the E file. This is often an error that's made by people when they start playing chess. They do something like put the kings on their own color, or they put the kings opposite each other this way. So next, we have the rooks. So the rook's movement, and the rook captures in a similar way to the king. The rook's movement is that the rook can move either forward, backward, left, or right, sliding as many squares as you wish. Let's draw those lines again. But any number of squares you wish, sliding in a line. And similar to for all the pieces here, let's throw some extra pieces on the board. So if we look at black's rook in this position, black's rook could slide back to the 7th or 8th rank here, could move one square over to the left, but could not move any farther because its motion is blocked by another black piece, could not move at all to the right because there's a knight in the way, Then we could either move 1 square forward, down, or 2 squares down, or we could move 3 squares down, capturing the knight. We could not continue past the knight any either way. So that's the movement of the rooks. And in chess, you get 2 rooks. The 2 rooks start on your corners of the board. Okay, next we have the bishops. So the bishops move in a diagonal manner. So this white bishop can move as such. Note that it could capture the black bishop if it wanted to move this direction, but could not go through it. Very similar to the rook, but tilted diagonally, as it were. And similar to the black rook here, we have some motion. We could not move to our own pieces, or we could capture the white bishop as well, but could not move through it. And again, you get 2 bishops. The 2 bishops start on the F and C files. And we'll also note in a second, they start flanking the king and queen pair. Then next we have the queens. Now the queen in chess, besides the king, which is the sort of fundamental objective of the game to capture, the queen is the most tactically powerful piece you have in terms of its movement ability. The queen's movement is that it can make any move either a rook or a bishop could make. So the queen can make the vertical moves. It could capture this bishop if it wanted to. How did I do this? Okay. We could capture the bishop. We could, of course, move to any of the other squares. We can move horizontally, any number we'd like. We can't go through our own pieces because it is the combination of rook and bishop moves. But you have this idea the queen can move in any of the 8 directions in a straight line, any number of squares, and then it is either, but it cannot move through your own pieces, and if it captures an enemy piece, that's all the farther it can move, and it can't choose not to capture and teleport through them or anything. So the white queen in this position could move here, could capture here, could move to any of these squares. And obviously this is quite powerful because that presents a lot of options. The queen goes next to the king in the center of the board. And you only get 1 queen, so it fills that square. The next piece, and honestly the one that gives people the most trouble when trying to play and keep track of all the options available on board, is the knight, which I frequently call the horsey. Some people get very mad when you call the knights horsies, but it's okay. So the knight's movement is described in a lot of different ways. First, the knight is weird in that it essentially teleports from its starting square to its movement square. So the knight moves in what looks like an L shape of of 2, either up, down, left, or right, and then 1 branching off sideways from that initial movement. But the key thing is that this does not happen as 2 moves. This happens as the knight simply going from the square it starts on to the square it ends up on. And the knight, in some sense, can jump over its own pieces. So let's say we had a knight here. Let's say we had some of our other pieces here, and black had a 3rd bishop, which is not how the game works, but let's just say black's knight here. If it was white's turn, the white knight could move to either of these 2 squares. It could not move to either of these two squares, because there are pieces in the way, either of these two squares on the sideways and then up or down, could move to this square by going 2 up and 1 to the left. Right? It teleports, it's not sliding up and then left, it simply goes from here to here and is allowed to jump pieces, as it were. Or it could capture the black knight here. Similar to all the other pieces, if the knight moves onto a square with an enemy piece, it captures it, and you cannot move onto a square with your own piece. So you get 2 knights. I think you can guess where the knights go, given that the space wasn't filled yet. And the final piece to discuss are the pawns. So pawns start in, we sort of have to put them on their starting square to talk about them. Let's do these two. So the pawns, the foot soldiers of the chess army, their movement rule is as such. When a pawn is on its initial square, it can either move 1 square forward, or it can move 2 squares forward. Any other time, when a pawn is somewhere in the middle of the board, it may only move 1 square forward. Now, there is an additional interesting thing about pawns, which is that their movement and their capturing, unlike the other pieces, are different. So if we have 2 pawns that are in the middle of a board, this pawn cannot capture this pawn. Pawns capture diagonally forward. And note, with all of these, the pawns cannot move back down the board after they've moved forward. They can only move that 1 square forward. So in this case, if there was another black pawn here, and it were white's turn to move, white could capture this black pawn, but could not capture the pawn immediately in front of it. And likewise, if it were black's turn, black could capture the white pawn, or could move down the board one square. So that's the basic movement rules for the pawns. And those are the movement rules for all the pieces, or the basic movement rules for all the pieces. There are some additional rules. There are a couple additional rules that are important to discuss. So first is the concept of pawn promotion. So let's just put some pieces on the board, talk about this. So pawn promotion is a rule that if one of your pawns makes it to the back row opposite its starting point, so for the white pieces, this is the 8th row, and for the black pieces, this is the 1st row. If it makes it to that square, when the pawn moves there, you must replace it with either a knight, a bishop, a rook, or a queen, notably not with a second king or keeping it as a pawn. And generally speaking, you'll almost always replace your pawn with a queen because the queen is the most powerful piece in the abstract. So if we imagine this as a small miniature game, if it was white's turn to move, white would feel obliged to move here to catch up to this pawn. Black would realize the pawn can't get away, maybe just moves the king. White takes the pawn, black moves, white moves, black moves. And now we would be in a position where white is wondering if they can get this pawn clear down to the end of the board so they can turn it into a queen and then try to forcibly capture the king. Or, of course, and just to show the actual process, if I were to somehow sneak past the black king and I have a pawn over here, we make some moves. If my pawn makes it to this 8th rank, I can put a queen on that square. Normally you'll put a queen. I can put a rook on that square. I can put a bishop, or I can put a knight And then, not to get into detail, but this is one such way that the game might end from here. Let's not think about whether these moves are good. What I'm trying to do is capture my opponent's king. Now the king is in check, so king runs away. Let's just say the king keeps running. And again, these are not thought out, highly strategic moves. At this point, the king is in check again, but there's nowhere for black to run, so the king is in checkmate, and this would be a win for the white pieces. But again, that's pawn promotion, that if a pawn makes it to the last rank of the board, you immediately turn it into either a queen, rook, knight, or bishop. Okay, pawn promotion. The second rule also has to deal with pawn movement. It is the en passant rule. The en passant rule is if I have as a white, we'll do both of these versions, is that if you have as white a pawn on the 5th rank or as black a pawn on the 4th rank, and your opponent has a pawn on its initial square, if it's your opponent's turn and they move their pawn 2 squares forward, so in white's case it would be 2 squares forward over here, on your next turn, immediately after they've made this 2 forward move, if you have a pawn sitting on this 4th or 5th square, you may capture as if their pawn had only moved 1 square. This rule, not to dig into history, was introduced so that you can't sneak your pawns past by, waiting for me to march up the board and then going, haha, I snuck past you. I would still have the option only on the turn immediately after to capture as if you had only moved your pawn 1 square, in which case my pawn would go here and this pawn would disappear into the ether. So that's the en passant rule. Doesn't come up that often, but it does matter. And finally, we have the rules for castling. Castling is a rule involving the rooks, and it's a little bit, well, it's got some, castling rule often I think gets explained unclearly, so I'm going to do the best I can here to explain it without leaving out any of the details. So I'm just setting up the board back to its initial starting configuration. You'll see why in a second here. Now the castling rules is a rule that helps your king run for safety. You don't need to understand why I'm making these moves. It's just sort of a normal opening to a game. Now the castling rule is that if there is, actually let's just leave that. So it's white to move in this position. The castling rule is that if my king and my rook are on the squares they start the game on, and they have not moved at all. So if at some point the king had gone up and then down, you can't do this, even though the king is back where it started. If the king and rook are on their initial squares, you get to do this special move where the king moves 2 squares towards the rook of your choice that's got the open space. And if there's no pieces in between the king and the king can move 2 squares towards the rook, and the rook would flip to the other side. The one additional rule there is that you cannot castle. Let's just throw in some additional moves on the board. Actually, let's go back to a slightly clearer case. So if we were to imagine these are the only pieces on the board, if it's white's turn, white could castle kingside, or white could castle queenside, long castling. Note that when you go to the left, the rook also flips to the opposite side. It doesn't So the king ends up 2 squares from the edge, not 1. And there are 3 different things to prevent castling. The first is if either of the pieces have moved at all. The second is if there is any piece in between them, you cannot castle in this direction. So if this was all that was on board, you could castle to the left, but not to the right. The third rule is that you cannot castle. One, you cannot castle if your king is in check. So here my king is attacked, so I cannot castle at all. Note the rook can be attacked. Secondly, you cannot castle if your king either would be checked at the end of the castling, so you can't do this, or if the king would be in check if it only moved 1 square in that direction. So let's say this was a light squared bishop. I could not castle to the left here because this square, 1 to the left of the king, is under attack. So I'll cover in detail, sort of discussing how checkmates actually happen, maybe showing a sample game, and talking more about how chess games actually end. But we've covered the piece movement, the en passant rule, the promotion rule, the castling rule, and the objective of the game, which is capturing the enemy king. So that's all of the basic rules. I think we'll talk about showing how games actually end in practice when I make part 2 of the rules. But I think this video has everything you need to try and play chess on your own. Thank you for watching, everybody. Please subscribe to the channel. You can check us out on Facebook. It should be visible on your screen. I'll have a part 2. Please leave any questions. If anything was ambiguous, I'll try to make a follow-up video covering it. Just comment and tell me what you need additional clarification on. Thanks for watching, and have a nice day.